Today I'm speaking with Dan Barker. Dan, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a real pleasure, Tim.
Absolutely. It's an honor. I can't even express how much of an honor it is to be speaking with you directly. And just to give a quick bio for Dan, from childhood, Dan was creating Christian music with his family. He became an evangelist at age 15, and soon after that became a missionary to Mexico. He was ordained to the ministry in 1975 and became a preacher and served at several churches. He received a degree in religion from Azusa Pacific University, and he and his wife, Annie Laurie Gaylor, are the current co-presidents of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which we'll talk about later. And that's a free thought organization that promotes the separation of church and state. He is also a co-founder of the Clergy Project, a group that helps people who are currently in ministry who are deconstructing and deconverting. Dan is a longtime speaker at free thought and atheist conventions. He's also a writer. He's written many articles, but also many books, including Godless, How an Evangelical Preacher Became One of America's Leading Atheists, Losing Faith in Faith, From Preacher to Atheist, God, which I've got here, God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction, and I was going to mention to you, it's fallen apart. I was always told when your Bible's falling apart, it's probably a good sign you're not. So when this book is falling apart, it's probably a good sign that I'm doing okay. Um, and Life-Driven Purpose: How an Atheist finds Meaning. And there's a whole bunch of other books, but I'll have the link for his Amazon page beneath this, so please go check it out. We're also going to mention later on that he's working on his latest book called Contradiction. That's coming out in September. Is that right?
Yes, it's already in print. It's in the process of being printed.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I have a lot of questions about that, so we'll be getting to that towards the end of the interview. But that's what I know about you so far, Dan. If you could tell us more about yourself and tell us some fun things too.
Well, I think you probably understand, Tim, since you prepared for the ministry, what it was like. Our stories were different, of course, but I bet there's a similarity there. To feel like you were called by God for a special purpose. That there's meaning in life because of our Creator and the sacrifice He gave for us, and all of that. The gospel, the good news, the reliability of the Bible. I was born into it, and I loved it, and I felt I was so special. I mean, just think, what are the odds? I was born into the right country, in the right family, in the right religion, in the right denomination, with the right interpretation of the Bible, with a loving family and community, and a feeling of like, wow, this is great. I mean, how special can a person be? And, I used to believe, and I used to preach, and you probably did too, that God has no grandchildren. Just because you're born into the faith doesn't mean you're necessarily what your parents are. So in my teens, I made a decision to accept Jesus as my Savior and confess my sins, and you know that whole story. Accept Him into my heart and become that new born again creature. And besides the faith, because I used to preach that faith alone is enough, but besides the faith, I also had the feelings. I thought, this is great. Wow. And I felt wonderful. I felt like the Holy Spirit was touching me. And I don't think I believe that was necessary for salvation, but still, a lot of us really just got into it. I mean, it just felt wonderful, raising the hands and praising God, expecting the second coming. Who knows when? It could be tonight. Are you ready to meet God if it happens tonight? All of that. It was looking back on it, it seems kind of crazy, but at the time it didn't seem crazy at all. It seemed like this is beautiful. Who would not want something so wonderful? So, and then when I was 15, I accepted what I was convinced was a call to the ministry, to go into the Great Commission, go into the world, preach the gospel to every creature. And I felt God was telling me, you don't have to wait to go to seminary and just start preaching. So I did. I was that guy on campus in high school, with a big Bible under my arm, going up, smiling at the other students, thinking they would just be so happy to see someone with so much love. And you know that guy I'm talking about, right?
Oh yeah,
Who's maybe you were that way too.
for sure.
And I didn't feel like I was pestering anybody. I didn't feel like I was like, I thought, who would not want to know this? This is good news. This is the gospel of Jesus. And in fact, in my book, Godless, I tell the story of my Spanish teacher in high school, Mr. Edwards. Everybody knew Mr. Edwards was an agnostic. Well, he and I got to talking, and then as a result of that, he became a born-again Christian, and we started a Bible class on campus, not long after the 1963 ruling, the Schempp decision about Bible reading in the schools. We went ahead and did it anyway. And that club went for like 20 more years, I think, after I graduated. But anyway, so I went down into Mexico as a missionary just as a young teenager. I was preaching, I was out playing the piano and singing, and I was doing gospel recordings and writing gospel music. And when I was 16, some of my music was being played on the radio, gospel stuff, and I thought, this is really cool. And I thought,
Wow.
well, this is what God wants. I did go to Azusa Pacific, as you mentioned, and got a degree in religion, and that was nice. I mean, Azusa at the time was, it's probably better now, but at the time it was more like a notch above a glorified Sunday school. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We were trained, but it wasn't like really serious Bible training. It was more like how to interpret the book of Romans and Hebrew poetic literature. And I mean, it was good stuff. And so I got my degree, and then I was ordained to the ministry, and I was an associate pastor in 3 different California churches. One was a friend's church, which was not really my tradition, but I just got married and that was my wife's background. You know, the California Friends, that's the church that Richard Nixon came out of. That whole, you know, the like the modern day Quakers. And I liked them. They were good people. And then I went from there, I was called by God to go to an Assembly of God church of all things, because my family was more of a charismatic Pentecostal tradition, and I was an associate pastor there, music and preaching. And then I went up to Central California to independent charismatic church, which was part of the Disciples of Christ, but which became like a charismatic. And after that, I spent 8 years as a cross country evangelist, thinking the world was going to end, you know, any minute.
Hmm.
And it was totally living by faith. And if you're not a believer, you may not know what that phrase means. It wasn't just having faith in your life, it was living by faith. We didn't charge, we didn't have contracts, we didn't expect, we just day to day. And I remember traveling to some church in Tennessee and preaching, and then going out to the car afterwards to open the love offering to see if there's enough cash to get to the next church, kind of thing. You know what I mean? It was like just living day to day, trusting God to provide our needs, and preaching. And
Hmm.
during that time, I wrote some musicals, Christian musicals, which went on to become bestsellers for Man in Music, which was pretty surprising. And I did some follow-ups, and then I worked with Word Records, and then I went into Christian record production at the same time. So I was doing ministry, you know, preaching the gospel at the same time, also helping sing some of my own music, and also doing record production for other, mostly religious people. A lot of it was good stuff, and some of it was just to pay the rent. You know, it was like some pastor and his wife wanted a demo for their tour, you know, that kind of stuff. And I loved it. It was great. So I got to work in the Hollywood studios, and I hired some of the best musicians, and I made some friends with. I mean, we had top quality music going on.
Can I ask, with
Um,
the churches, did you actually like speak in tongues or uh,
yeah,
kind of hear God's voice audibly ever?
yeah. Well, not audibly. No, no, no. Spiritually, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I've talked to people. I debated a guy who said God talked to him audibly. It was weird, in front of an audience. Bob Seger. And I said, God talks to you audibly? And he said, yep. And I said, what does his voice sound like? And he said, well, it's a kind of a baritone. And I said, it's kind of like your voice? And he said, yeah, it sounds just like my voice. And the audience laughed. But anyway, I know I
That's
never
awesome.
heard like a voice, like hallucinating. But um, a lot of Christians will feel the spiritual voice of God talking to them. And when you're speaking in tongues, it's even magnified. It's just this amazing thing. And I think it happens in a lot of religions. So it's not a Christian thing, but even today, as an atheist, I can still do it. Which, what does that prove? It just proves that there's something in the brain that's doing this neat thing, and when it happens, it gives you goosebumps. It gives you like, whoa! And if you're getting that feeling, and you're talking in tongues, and you believe that there's a Holy Spirit and a God, then that just reinforces the whole thing, and you are talking with God. I mean, there's just this amazing thing that happens. And when it was happening, no one would have convinced me that it was phony. And I know that when other Christians say they're having their experiences, to them it's very, very real. And you know what? It is real. It's a very real thing happening in a very real brain, but it doesn't point to anything outside of the brain. It's a human thing that's going on. So
Yeah.
I have atheist friends who laugh and say, "You were just pretending, right?" No, and I said, "No, I wasn't. This was just an amazing thing that was happening." So because of my musical productions, my evangelism slash ministry sort of morphed more into kind of a, I wasn't like a big celebrity or anything, but it was more like I was getting more invited because of my music. So I would do like music preaching events. I would sit at the piano and, that kind of, and I did that for a number of years. I was a missionary to Mexico for about 2 years total, which I actually loved, not just for the ministry, but also just for the culture of it, just to be in another place. And I think a lot of missionaries, believers, whether they're still believers or not, really do appreciate that intercultural experience of having gone somewhere, and all of that. It's just an amazing thing.
Yeah,
And then
I did something very similar. I was in the Dominican Republic and in Papua New Guinea, and yeah, it blows your mind once you realize the world is so different in different places.
yeah, yeah. So did you learn Spanish?
Just enough to get myself in trouble. I actually learned Spanish more later. I was a custom cabinet maker, and I worked with some Mexican carpenters, and they would teach me some words. But I think some of the words they taught me were probably the bad words because they'd laugh after I'd repeat it. But
They're
I did learn
probably
some.
some
But
of the non-biblical words.
exactly. But it's amazing when you go to those cultures and you're like, this is so different. And yet, I think about how we now people like us who are on this side of it, we reflect that some of what we were doing was a version of colonialism. You think
Yeah,
we're trying to make them just like our white churches in America.
yeah, yeah. So I like to joke that God called me to Mexico to turn Catholics into Christians. they, of course, they thought they were Christians, and of course, we American Protestants were going to go down and give them the truth, right? And so it is kind of colonialism. Although, I have a great grandmother from Mexico and another from that area, so it wasn't like I felt like I was this big white savior or something. But and I loved it. And then I met Manuel Bonilla down there. Manuel Bonilla, a young man, and I was just a teenager. He went on to become the leading Spanish-speaking Christian recording artist in the world, and he's still selling like in like 15 different countries. He's in his 80s now, and he and I are still really good friends. And I got to produce a lot of his early albums, and he moved to LA, and so we did some groundbreaking stuff. We did the first really best-selling children's Christian albums in Spanish with good production. And then when we would go down to these countries, we would hear them playing on the radio. Then the kids would come running out of their homes singing the arrangements that we made. That was really kind of neat because there'd never been anything like that. And you can find it right now. Go online and look up Manuel Bonilla, and you'll see he actually, a lot of them are animated now. You'll hear me playing the piano, and I'm singing on some of it. And I got to tell you, musically, it was quite a challenge because finding children in Southern California who spoke good Spanish and who could sing on pitch and could sing under direction, that was a challenge, and we did it. It was one of the hardest things, and those kids are growing up now, but they said that was one of the funnest times of their life to go into the recording studio and be able to sing those tunes. So anyway, all of that was happening, and it felt wonderful. It felt like, wow, I'm called by God, and I'm doing exactly what He wants, and and a lot of Christians today say, well, Dan, you're an atheist now, so you must not really have known. You weren't really a real Christian. You hear that a lot. You probably get that. If you were a true Christian, you would never have left it. And I respond that, the Bible says, you shall know them by their fruits, right? It's not what you're judging. It's not what you think. You know them by their fruits. And my life exhibited all those fruits of the Spirit and all of that stuff. And if I was not a true Christian, nobody is, because it was real, it was powerful, and you could see the effects, and people came to Jesus as a result of my ministry, and lives were changed. There's a man who's in the pulpit right now who can credit me as having encouraged him to become a minister against his father's wishes. So if I was a phony, everybody is, and I guess maybe that's the lesson there, isn't it?
Probably. Can I ask you, looking back on that, do you feel either a sense of guilt or a sense of wanting to, kind of make things right by working hard in the other direction? Is that any part of your motivation for what you do?
Maybe. I mean, not everybody's like me. Maybe once a preacher, always a preacher. You just kind of that kind of thing. In the clergy project, most of them just want to leave it all behind. So I don't feel guilt. It'd be like feeling guilty for something you did as a 3-year-old. Yeah, you stole the cookies, but you were 3, right? So what would you have done different? So I don't feel
Yeah.
like I should have maybe known to do something different. That was just the life at the time. But maybe you're right. Maybe there's a little bit of wanting to undo the damage, and I think by now I think I've pretty much split that difference now. So having done all these debates at college, universities, and books and all of that, so it's not like anybody's keeping score, I don't think.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
yeah,
I do want to ask about something you said a little bit ago. The idea that the end of the world is coming, Jesus is coming back, that apocalyptic mentality. Did you get into the whole date setting? Like, did you think there was a specific time frame, or just this, he's just coming back soon?
no, no date.
Okay.
No, I wasn't that sophisticated, as far as digging into all that stuff. No, but like a thief in the night, and it was sort of the standard preaching fare. If Jesus came tonight, would you be ready? And I believed it. I thought it could happen anytime. I didn't want to try to second guess when. I do remember though, after one of my musicals was published, His Fleece Was White as Snow. I got invited to these churches because I was the composer and so I would give like these Sunday evening, presentations. And one church in Southern California had performed the musical, and it's a musical for children. There's a Christmas one and an Easter one, and so and you can do it with puppets, or the kids can dress up. Well, in this church, the adults dressed up and did the whole thing, which was kind of cool. And so they invited me to the church. So I was on this big stage, this big front of the church, and there's a pulpit, and there was a big wooden sign stretching all the way across above there. You could look up, and it says, "Jesus is coming soon." Big sign up there. And I glanced up at it, and I noticed the paint was peeling off of here, and there was spider webs over there behind that. So how long has that sign been up there? It's probably still there. Jesus is coming soon. Every generation of Christians has thought they were in the end times. Every single one. Even Jesus said there'll be some here who won't taste death until you see the signs. And the Millerites in the 1800s, and of course Harold Camping giving exact dates. So I didn't go that far, but I thought it could be. And I sometimes would pray, God, let me live one more day to bring one more soul into the kingdom before you return. Just one more sermon, one more time, and then we'll all go to heaven forever. So
Hmm.
I believed it, but it was more general than specific.
Yeah. And then you said you were married once before, is that right?
Yeah, Carol and I got married. We met in college. We met at Azusa Pacific College. We have 4 children, great children.
And I assume
And
that was like the assumption was you're going to raise your family to love the Lord and be soldiers for Jesus.
yeah, but I don't think either of us were like overbearing parents. We thought, I can't speak for her, but I think she probably agreed that each child would make their own decisions, but we would
Right.
nurture them in the faith. And then, of course, the marriage didn't last, mutually didn't last because of my change, basically. And then she went on, she remarried a Baptist minister. And she always viewed herself as a helpmeet, you know what I mean, to a ministry. And I think they're happy. And I think, I'm glad. I mean, I'm glad that the ending of the marriage didn't like ruin her life or something. So, and then Annie Laurie and I got married in 1987, and we have one daughter. So,
Hmm.
Sabrina.
That's awesome. When you were at the stage of, really starting to be in full-time ministry, and you're just preaching and you're singing, you're creating all this stuff that for the Lord, for the churches, what were some of the early things that made you just not necessarily think this is heading in the direction of deconstruction or deconversion, but just, I don't even know if those were words that people used back then, but like what were some of the early signs that made you just think, besides the whole end of the, Jesus is coming back soon thing, what were some of the other early signs that made you just think, I need to re-examine my worldview?
So the second coming was not a big issue,
Okay.
because I understood that human beings get things wrong. God was the ultimate truth, and that human beings have their interpretations. And so later, of course, it was an issue. But most of my deconversion process, it took 4 or 5 years. Like sort of my like around the age of 30, I started thinking. Most of it happened within Christianity. It wasn't like one morning I woke up as an evangelical and go, oh, there's no God. Oh, how could I be so stupid? Um, it was like, and I think it happens with most Christians. Most Christians change and move and shift, you know. So for me, it was like gradually moving my theology within the faith, and it wasn't until way later that I realized, oops, I moved all the way out. Kind of even accidentally. It wasn't like I wanted to. It's kind of like growing up, you know. It'd be like asking you, when did you grow up, Tim? You probably couldn't point to one moment, but you might be able to point to a general period in your life, you know, that kind of a thing. But since you asked if there was any early thing, yeah, I remember something. It didn't cause me to lose my faith, but I remember I was invited to a church in Southern California again. This was, I think it was American Baptist, and they wanted me to do my preaching music. I think they had performed one of my musicals. And before the service, I met in the pastor's office, and this happens a lot. You know, you have kind of like a prayer time before the meeting starts. Dear God, bless this meeting, and you know that kind of like a football huddle. All right, we're gonna get through this.
Oh yeah.
So we were talking briefly, and I'd getting to know this pastor, and getting to know kind of what's their theology, because I was invited to a whole bunch of different, not just extreme Bible believing churches. I was invited by a big cross section of churches, some even more liberal because they'd performed the music too. And he said, you know, we're a very Bible believing church here. Our congregation is very solid, you know, evangelical, born again. He said, but there's a couple in my church that they're really smart, they're really good people, but they don't think Adam and Eve were actually literal historical people. They think that was more like a allegory or a myth.
Mm.
And I thought, what? And you let them be members? What? You know, because that makes God a liar. The book of Genesis doesn't say this is an allegory. This is a myth. And I was really surprised. And he said, well, don't get me wrong. I disagree with these members. I think Adam and Eve really were real people, the first two people. But these people think that it doesn't matter. It's the message that's important. It's not the exact story. Just like when Jesus told the parables of the prodigal son, for example, Jesus did not intend us to think there actually was a prodigal son. He was making up a story, right? Does it matter? Maybe there was a prodigal son, maybe there wasn't. But why is that important? The important thing is the underlying message. And so these members of his congregation said that they think it doesn't matter if Adam and Eve existed. It's the fall of the human race and that underlying structure. And I remember thinking, there's other Christians who have a different interpretation from me. Kind of shows you how sheltered you can be, you know. And I remember in my mind a little click happened. It wasn't like abandoning the faith, and I didn't abandon Adam and Eve, the historicity of that. I just remember thinking, oh, so there are differences of opinion within the faith, and I guess that's okay. Now that might seem like a little thing, right? But for me as a fundamentalist, that was a big thing to admit, that we could have differences and still love each other and get along and still call ourselves brothers and sisters in Christ, even though we disagreed theologically on some point. So that was, I remember that, thinking that, and what that was like a little nudge, not toward atheism, but a little nudge toward being more liberal and less hard-nosed, you know, less, and basically that started like a 4 or 5 year process of these little nudges where I thought, oh, okay, I'm becoming more grown up now, more sophisticated. I don't have to be one of these, you know, obnoxious black and white fundamentalist types. I can be more subtle. I can be more, you know, I can understand things in a bigger, you know what I mean, that kind of thing. And I just kept moving and moving. And after a couple of years, I found myself more in the middle theologically, still a Christian, never imagining not being a Christian, and still more kind of moving. But that process didn't stop. And that gradation just never stopped until even not just Adam and Eve, and is Adam and Eve a myth, or Is the prodigal son or the Good Samaritan, are these just parables that are stories that humans made up? Uh, what other character in the Bible could be like that? Maybe Yahweh is also. Maybe Yahweh is one of these Good Samaritan, prodigal son, Adam and Eve stories that they made up. Does it matter if it's real or not? So, um,
Wow.
so to make a long story short, in 1983, I realized one day, wait a minute, well, what's there? You peel back the onion. Well, what's there? And I realized I didn't believe literally anymore. I found value in some of the lessons, obviously, but I just didn't believe literally. And it wasn't long after that I said, you know what? I don't think that God really is real anyway. It was an invention of those people who wrote those stories. So
I was curious with kind of reshaping your questions and answers to your theology. How did hell play into that in terms of, I assume you were believing early on that there was a literal hellfire waiting for non-believers. How did that evolve and at what point did that become a crucial part of the journey?
yeah, hell is a big question, and I think for most of Christianity, hell is the motivator, whether you admit it or not. A lot of Christians will say, no, hell's not the motivator. The love of God is the motivator. That's what motivates me. But um, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish. Should not perish. There's that hell. There's that threat. And I believed it, but I didn't really preach hell that much. I guess I was more preaching the love of God kind of a preacher. But I believed in hell, yeah. And as a child, of course, it was scary to think, oh no, I could go. I mean, and it's not only that it's scary, it's that we were taught that we actually deserved it. Just by being born a human being, we actually deserved it. Original sin. And there's a lot of theologies about original sin, but in the evangelical community, it's a real thing. We are corrupt. We are not deserving. We're deserving of eternal torment because of what bad people we are. And so, you can't sell heaven until you sell hell. You can't, as an evangelist, you can't sell salvation without first selling damnation. You got to be saved from something, right? It's kind of like if anybody who's in sales, you're a traveling salesperson, you got to convince somebody that they need this vacuum cleaner or they need this product. You got to convince them and they need it, then you can sell it to them. So that's half of the job of evangelism, is convincing people that there is a threat. They're in danger. Something's wrong. Something's bad with you, and it needs to be fixed. And either I or the gospel or the Bible or Jesus has the answer for you. And then you can, if you get them hooked there, then they're very likely then to want to have your solution. It's kind of like, looking back on it, it's kind of like, how much respect should we have for a medical doctor who goes around cutting people with knives so that he can sell them a Band-Aid? Hey, I'll fix this for you. First I got to hurt you, then I'll fix it. And you have my book, God the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction. I have a whole section in there showing how the God of the Bible causes the harm so that he can heal it. Isn't that something? I'm bringing this plague upon you so that I can give you my blessings. All these. So anyway,
Crazy.
but I don't think hell was much of a motivator in leaving the faith, because that might make it seem like I had an emotional reason rather than an intellectual reason. And for me, basically, my reasons for becoming an atheist were primarily intellectual.
I guess I meant it. Yeah, I know what you mean. Where like the emotional part of it. I guess I meant the intellectual sense of like, does this make sense that a God would do this? Like I've said to my kids as I try to protect them, I'll say, look, there's a cast iron pan here on the stove, and it's cold. But I'm like, look at that. If I crank the temperature up, and that cast iron pan's really hot, and I put a little oil in the bottom, and I took your finger, just one finger, and I put it in that hot oil for just for 1 second, would I be a good daddy or a bad daddy? And be like, of course, oh, you'd be a bad daddy. And be like, what if I held your whole hand in there for like a minute? Oh, you'd be a horrible daddy. What if I held it in there forever and I just, expand it out? And that's like that sense of like this, there's an emotional side to it, but there's also just this doesn't make sense. You can't be
Yeah.
a good father and hold your kid's fingers on the pan.
There's a moral side to it. And course, I would have preached that um, God's not doing that to you because you have an out. You have an out. There's Jesus. So I mean, what's to worry about? You all you just accept Jesus, and so but you're right. Any system of thought, a moral system that has to make its point with a threat of violence, is a morally bankrupt system. It should be true because it's true, not because you're going to be punished. And if that's why you're a Christian, because I don't want to be punished and I want to live forever in heaven and be coddled in this bliss, that's not a moral choice. That's not even an intellectual choice. It's really an offer you can't refuse kind of a choice. So I would say, there's different theologies about the character of God, but I would say that if there's a God who created a hell, and who else would have created it? For those of us who refuse to bow down and worship and adore him, well, if that's the kind of big macho man he is, then let him prove what a big macho man he is by sending me there, right? I mean, how does that gain any respect or integrity at all? It just shows that he's the big, powerful gorilla, right? So if that God did exist, and it doesn't, but if that God did exist, I would say, you created hell, you go to hell. You're the monster. You're the one who's with the moral problems. You're the one who deserves, if anyone deserves torture, and I don't think anyone does, but if they do, you're the one who should be going there.
And a corollary I say to my kids too is, if anybody needs salvation, it's Yahweh, not us. So
Yeah.
he's the biggest sinner in the room. But since we're talking about hell, I was just going to mention, I want to make a quick plug for this, because honestly, this is like something that I'm so appreciative of what you've done. I'm going to put a link for this, but for everyone who hasn't seen it yet, please go check out a video of Dan on a presentation called "You Don't Have to Go Down into my Basement." That is just absolute gold, and it's about this topic, in some ways about hell. Like, does this make sense?
Sometimes hell is such an abstract thing that we don't realize what it is. And so that little story is a way to kind of make it become real. I do want to say that Bart Ehrman has a book out about hell. Now I'm forgetting the title. We had him on our TV show. He makes a case biblically that hell is not eternal. That hell, there's a lake of fire that's eternal, but you just go in, the lake of fire is there, but you're going to die and you're going to suffer, but it's not forever and ever and ever and ever.
On a similar but related note, angels and demons, when you were in Christianity, how much did that play a part of your life? Did you get into the whole concept of like, they're all around you, they're fighting above your head, and if you're in church listening to a preacher, the reason you're kind of nodding off or distracted by something is because there's a demon trying to keep you from listening to the preacher. Was that part of your worldview? And maybe a related question: when you started to deconstruct, did you ever fear that maybe this is all the devil's trying to get me, and I'm actually just like going down the temptation path of deconstruction?
Yeah, exactly. I did believe it in demons and angels, primarily because the Bible says they're real. I don't know how much I thought that maybe there were actually these spooky ghost things around. You know what I mean? Maybe. The Bible says it, so as one of these facts of the Bible, that there are principalities and powers, and so even though I didn't make it concrete, like, oh, there's an angel right there kind of thing, I did imagine and I did believe that I was being watched, either by God or by the devil or by angels, that my life had zero private moments in it. I was always being watched or judged, by my thoughts were being monitored by something out there, either good or bad. And that was one of the most refreshing things becoming an atheist, to realize that all of that's gone. I'm alone. If I'm in a room alone with myself, I'm in a room alone. There's no big eyeballs judging all that or trying to influence. So I know different Christians are different in their psychology, and psychology plays a lot into what kind of beliefs you have. But for me, yes, intellectually, I said angels and demons exist, and that I probably believed that they were influencing. And I remember early on when I was having these questions, I didn't call them doubts, I called them questions. I remember thinking, yeah, well, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm being misled here? Then I'm going to be punished forever. And I had to make a decision. All right, do I want to go down the path of fear and just stay? Or do I want to follow a path of open inquiry and integrity and see where that leads? I had to make that choice. And a lot of people don't make that choice. They, oh, no, 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 I'm staying over here because this is safe. But if I do this, I don't know what I'm risking. So I remember doing that. And I chose this path. And I'm glad.
Was there any part of you at that point, as you were making that choice for that path, where you thought to yourself, not just the fear of the demons are tempting you, but just that you're actually, in a sense, bucking God. You're almost giving God the middle finger. God, all this time, has been your judge. He's the king. He's on the throne. You remember those stories? I remember it. I was at a Billy Graham crusade, even one time as a counselor with him, and not directly, just obviously with thousands of other counselors. But he would talk about, God wants to be the king. He's the king of your life, and you got to get off the throne. He's the king. And I think for a lot of us, when we start to ask these questions, that fear factor comes in of, am I truly like making the biggest mistake of my eternal and current life? Meaning, I am telling God, get off your throne, that's mine. Did that pride question come up for you?
Yeah, but I was the kind of Christian that viewed God, of course, as the ultimate sovereign, but more like a friend, more like we have a relationship, and there's nothing I can hide from you if you're real, and you see all my thoughts, and you know my motives, and so if you want to judge me, you can. It was more like that. It was um, that we not that God and I were partners, of course, but I felt like for me it was more of a friendly, loving kind of relationship rather than a fearful, cowering, bowing down before this big emperor who has all this power. Yeah, intellectually and in the Bible you see that, and you see too much of that in the Bible, I think. But um, the fear was more like it wasn't so much that kind of a fear. It was more like, all right, I'm going to try this. Tell me if I'm wrong, God. That was more like, and if I am, I'll come back. It was. I guess I was respecting both of us at the same time. I was respecting God's authority, but He gave me this brain, and I was respecting the brain as well. See where it goes.
Yeah, good answer. I like that. I was curious about, and I'm going to try to get back to the track of your story in a little bit, but I wanted to just ask a few more questions to kind of set a groundwork for kind of where you were coming from. Patriarchy and misogyny. Men are in charge. Men are the preachers. Women are there to, in many churches, keep silent, and maybe at least if they're able to be more vocal, they're limited to male leadership. What was that like in your church background and your family background? And how did that begin to change as you began to deconstruct? How did you change your view of women and their roles? And especially like how did the conversations go when you finally were able to be with Annie? And like what how did she affect your view of women's roles and feminism and so forth?
So all of that patriarchy, I don't think we even knew what that word was, but all of that was sort of an underlying assumption. God is male, His disciples are male, God has a son, He's our Father. All of that, of course, was just part of the air we breathed. Um, so um, maybe maybe I inherited some of that attitude, and it's cultural. I think it's largely cultural. My family happened to be more of a gentle. We weren't like big pushy patriarchal type of a family. My dad's American Indian, and my mom was simple, and we were just a happy family. It wasn't like we were trying to be these obnoxious born agains. But that question you raised did play a part in my first marriage because the feminist movement was really up and coming back then, and I remember thinking, just the kind of person I am, maybe, or maybe just thinking in general, that a relationship between two people should be horizontal like this. It should be, I choose you, you choose me, I respect you, you respect me. We both love and admire things about each other, and we're in it like this. But biblical marriage is this way. It's top down. There's a structure. There's a God. The Bill Gothard stuff and all of the pyramids, and There's God and Jesus and the husband and then the wife, and so there's a structure. But the wife is just as valuable because she has her role. And personally, I didn't like that. Personally, I wanted someone to love and respect me this way. You know what I mean? We're two people, and we really just love to be together, like really good friends. I did not want this. I didn't, because then that implies some coercion or phoniness, like I have to be beneath you and you have to tell me what I. That's this structure is corrupting in a relationship. So, to her credit, my first wife kind of tried to bend a little bit. I kept telling her, I don't want to be your boss. I don't want to be your lord. Like, who am I? I'm a guy, right? I know there are a lot of Christian men who do want to be the boss. They do want to be the lord over their family. They do want to exercise this manly control. And you've seen these events with these, I don't get it. I don't know how insecure these men are. I don't understand, why they feel that way. But I know a lot of them do. And so, but my first wife, she said she could only bend so far without breaking because she was a true, and she still is a true believer. And I remember asking her, well, okay, under our current system of theology, I was toward the end of my process there. You are the wife and I'm the husband, and technically I am your master and Lord. So I'm not saying I would ever do this, and I shouldn't, but if I were to tell you to deconvert, would you? You know what I mean? She said, of course not. And I said, well, then you have your own mind. You're making your own choices as a woman, right? You're free to do that. And I would never want to force you to think like I think just because I'm demanding it of you, right? So that played a part in, not in my deconversion, but it played a part in our marriage not being able to last.
Hmm. And how did Annie kind of enhance some of that thought as you got married? What topics did she bring to the table for kind of from a more secular perspective?
Well, so that was later. We got married in '87. Um, but see now, so this is ideal. Now we're having our like 37th anniversary. What was it? 80? Yeah, so 37th coming up.
Congrats.
And we are two separate people. Um, she kept her last name. I kept my last name. We had a problem trying to pick a last name for our daughter. Um, I moved here to Wisconsin, where Annie Laurie Gaylor lives with her mother and her family and all that. So her last name is Gaylor, Gaylor. My last name is Barker. And we were thinking, so we're going to have a daughter. Do we want to do a hyphenated or what? Um, and and I said, let's just keep it Gaylor because here we are. Her whole Gaylor family's here. Why does she have to have my name? Why does that make any difference? Besides that, we were experimenting with hyphenated names and calling our daughter Sabrina Gay Bar just didn't seem right. So, so she's Sabrina Gaylor. She goes by the nickname of Glenn. So Annie, Laurie, and I both know that it's this, right? And we differ in so many ways, but it's complementary in most of the ways. And we are co-presidents now of the foundation. Uh, there was a front page story of the two of us in the local newspaper, and the reporter asked Annie Laurie, "How do you describe your roles? You're a married couple, but you're co-presidents of this national group." And she said, "Well, I'm the practical one, and he's the philosophical one." And she's right, and it's a good role. So she's always had her own bank account, her own finances, her own income. Same with me. We're separate people, even though we're married under the law and all that. And then we have a budget and we pull into a joint account kind of thing for household expenses and all that. But we each know that each person is different and separate. And if you really like each other and admire each other's people, that's what makes a friendship last, whether you want to call it a marriage or not. We have a lot of friends who have lifelong committed relationships and they don't want to get married. They don't think marriage adds anything to that. And so marriage is a cultural convention, but what really matters is who are you as individuals, and do you really like each other? I mean, do you really get along well with each other? So I like that. That works a lot better than this structure that I'm supposed to be some. I mean, it puts a lot on a guy to think I have to be this decision maker. And a lot of guys are too stupid to be decision makers. Usually it's the wife who's trying to figure out how to turn it this way. But so that played very little in my intellectual deconversion, but it was a nice benefit to be able to get rid of all that problems of patriarchy.
Hmm, that's awesome. Taking it back a little bit to your story, I wanted to ask, when you really could articulate for the first time, I am out, like I've escaped. And I know there's a lot of ramifications. Now you have to figure out, what to do for work and all that. But before you got into that stage of it where you're just intellectually saying, I don't believe this anymore, what were some of the losses that meant something to you? For example, just that, the whole mythos that's woven into our worldview, the idea of, if you are feeling like, your life is hard, or this, like, you can always look forward to the afterlife where God's going to show you how he's been creating this beautiful picture, or just the fact that you get to see him and he's your heavenly father that wants to wrap you up in his loving arms, or the idea of justice, of like, I want the people that have hurt our world and hurt me personally to face justice someday at the judgment seat of Christ. Like, what were those issues that you felt like were like, wow, Christianity, like, I'm done with it, and it's kind of like a non-issue anymore, but it also broke my heart because I was vested. I was doubling down, as it were, into this worldview, and now it's a complete loss. What felt like a pain to you as you reflected on it?
Well, yeah, all of that. I went through about a 1 year period of, there needs to be a word. Someone needs to make a word for it. It's not grieving. Like if somebody dies, it takes a while for your brain to readjust. If you have a divorce, it takes a while. If some big thing happens in your life and your brain has all been invested in this, and now that's gone, it doesn't just happen overnight. I remember a few months later, I would still say, praise the Lord, when things happened, even though I was an atheist, So there's all these habits that are there. But for me, anyway, the richness, the value, the beauty of science and reason and philosophy and knowledge, the all of that to be gained from that way overshadowed any loss I might have had. It might be asking a 6-year-old, how are you dealing with your loss of Santa Claus? Well, there's a loss there, right? But you're growing up too. So yeah, there was a bit of that, but you know, pie in the sky, the promise of heaven. Yeah, that's kind of a interesting, neat thing to think about. Oh, when I die, I'm going to go and live forever. But I realized really early on that there's no loss there at all, because that would cheapen life. In life, we give value to things that are rare. We give more value to things that are rare than things that are plentiful, right? So if life is eternal, then life is cheap. And the fact that life's going to end actually makes it more precious, more beautiful, because it is going to end. And so thinking intellectually about that compared to thinking emotionally about that, the balance in my mind falls way, way over here. Yeah, I gave up. It'd be like asking somebody who had I don't know, maybe somebody who was blind and lived their whole life doing just fine, and then they regain their eyesight. Well, don't you miss it? I mean, well, yeah, of course you miss it. You have to change and you have to grow, but what value is there in losing something that's non-existent in the first place? It's just a hope. It's just a dream that you might have, that if you can get over it, you can grow up a little bit.
Do you think, if you found out right now that you could live forever, would you want to?
No, probably not. Maybe another 100 years, maybe a couple hundred more years. But why forever? If you found out you could live forever, well, then it's kind of pointless. Real purpose and real meaning in life comes from struggles and solving problems and meeting challenges. And if we didn't have challenges to meet and problems to solve, we would be living a purposeless existence. So sitting up in heaven in a choir in bliss, I mean, that would be the most boring I would be thinking, come on, let's end this service. Let's get out and do something meaningful, you know? So I guess instinctively, any biological organism like us doesn't want to die. That's just an instinct. It's built into us. We avoid pain and suffering, and we avoid threats, and we try to build our lives in such a way that we minimize the risk of ending. So that's an instinctive animal thing that happens to all of us. But to translate that animal instinct into some metaphysical, supernatural deal, that's irrational. That's wishful thinking. It's, maybe somebody would think it was nice to live in these mansions of gold in the city that has just one street in it. It's that many, how high it is. But to me, that doesn't hold much appeal anymore.
Yeah, I hear you. I definitely understand that mentality. For me, it's definitely the other side where I wanted to live forever, and I still do. And I've had a lot of people, I asked people that question quite a few times in my interviews. There's just a part of me that like I still struggle with it because number one, I didn't think of the time going on forever issue. I just thought God is timeless. He can make a billion years feel like it's been 3 seconds. And also, I kind of always saw our world here as a mere dim reflection of what was coming in heaven and in the kingdom. And therefore, if you ignore the sin part of this world, but just say, what are the best parts of life? Well, the best parts of life are, of course, seeing the faces of your beautiful children and beautiful memories, and holding the hand of someone you love, and holding somebody, and of course, sexuality, and the ultimate, the moment of an orgasm. And to think, what if heaven is like an absolute million times better orgasm that you would truly never want to stop, and it's not going to stop, not in a sexual sense but in an emotional sense. Like God is just going to make it like you just cannot believe how beautiful and wonderful and pleasurable this experience is. And to me, I wanted it. I still want it, and I still struggle with the idea of someday it's going to be over and that's it. Like I don't have any delusions of grandeur. I don't think there's anything waiting for me, but I wish there were. And it's been a big struggle to get over that loss.
Well, maybe we're all different in how we interpret that. To me, that would seem like the end of life if that were to happen. Because what's the point? I mean, is the universe about me so that I can have pleasure? Is this what it's all about? But I like that joke Woody Allen said. I don't believe in life after death, but just in case I'm taking a change of underwear.
Nice. So again, going back to your story, what was it like when you were, in ministry, realizing, holy smokes, my life's got to change? How did you get out of ministry at that point with that worldview shift?
Yeah. And I talked to some of the other former preachers in the clergy project, and many of them went through the same thing. In fact, there are ministers right now in the pulpit, as we're speaking, who have lost their faith. They're atheists or agnostics, and they're looking for an exit strategy, and they're still preaching, not believing a word of it. And they have to, it's their income. They got to find another job. And I went through that period for about 4 or 5 months. In the summer of '83, I realized, I guess I'm an atheist. I didn't like that word. I didn't want to be it, but I guess that's what describes me. And I still had a calendar of invitations to preach at churches and things. And so maybe it's kind of like, your marriage is over, but when do you actually walk out the door? When do you actually, you know what I mean? There's loose ends, and there's, so that during that summer and fall of '83, I didn't believe it anymore. And I was still doing this, and I didn't get paid a lot of money for it, but it was like, I felt like I didn't want to back out, but I probably should have. I really should have. I should have just stopped. But how do you stop your life on a dime just, after all these years? And I was good at it. And I remember during those few months, I remember especially in one case, I was up in the pulpit and I was preaching before some church, and I was thinking, I shouldn't be doing this. This is not right. I'm not even sure this is even true what I'm saying anymore. I'm preaching the Bible, yeah, and people are saying amen, and people are, you know what I mean? It was like a real church. It was a real thing. In their minds, it was a real thing. And afterwards, a woman came up to me, and she said, Reverend Barker, I just want you to know, I really felt the Spirit of God on your ministry tonight. And I was thinking, you did? And so what does that tell you? What's going on there, right? This audience is kind of a self-selected audience that's coming. It's like a big drama, really. There's no preacher in the world that could have any success without people playing along with it. You've got this thing going on. And I didn't tell her anything. I didn't say I was, you know, being dishonest, because I was actually. I guess I was a hypocrite during those few months. And and then I finally got to a point in December of that year that I just said, I can't do this anymore. I almost stopped in the middle of a service. I almost just stopped and said, this is crap, you know. But
Wow. I would have loved to have seen that on video if that had happened.
It was horrible. I compare it to, you know, Pagliacci, the opera, where the clown has to go out and make people laugh, but just before going on stage, his heart was broken.
Mm-hmm.
And he's in tears, but he's got to go up on the stage and make people laugh because he's good at it, you know. And I kind of felt like, oh, this is horrible. I shouldn't be doing this. This is not fair to me or to them. But I'm a showman. I can do this. I'm going to play the piano. I'm going to preach these things, and the people loved it. And then that was the last time. I never did that again. But besides that, they had flown me up to Central California. And they hadn't yet given me my plane ticket home or anything. So what was I supposed to do? Just walk out into the night and just leave? But anyway, it was a few weeks later that I sent my letter out to everybody that I wasn't a believer and I wasn't going to be preaching. Well, I said, you could invite me to preach if you want, but it'll be a totally different sermon.
That's awesome. I love it. In terms of, you know, at that point, as you're escaping, in my words, you're getting out of Bible prison, as I like to call it. You're sort of reclaiming your identity, reclaiming your life. At that point, two questions. Could you kind of contrast the peace that you were feeling from when you were in Christianity versus out? And like, was the peace immediate, or was it like an angst for a while and then peace? What was it like, and how, you know, intense? What were the differences? And then, what was it like to just kind of hit the reset button? What were some of the things that you did early on to just kind of say, I've never really lived a day in my life. I've lived my whole life under the auspices of the umbrella of this King of Kings, Lord of Lords, who's never actually been there. I've never, you know, from the Matrix movie, I've never opened my eyes before. You know, I'm Neo. Now my eyes are open for the first time. How did the peace go, and how did you start to reset everything?
So by peace, do you mean PEACE?
Yeah,
Or
like just that
PI?
sense of like,
Oh,
I've got that peace that passes all understanding that we would have as Christians versus a sense of peace that you would have in your heart as an atheist.
yeah. Well, I did feel that peace. I guess that's the right word for it. Knowing that I was saved, knowing, I put that word knowing in quotes now, but knowing that I was, you know, born again and chosen by God and loved by God, all of that. So um, that was sort of a metaphysical peace, like I'm not going to be tortured forever. I'm not going to die and go to hell kind of peace. Which, looking back on it, of course, it's phony. It's a phony peace. You build up this big thing, and then you build up a solution to it, and wow, now I have peace. Uh, but I did, you know, when I was praying and when I was praying in the Spirit, and I did have this, uh, what, you know, spiritual experiences can be very calming. They can, I mean, it can be very affirming and integrative, and all of that. All of those things happened as a believer.
Even
Uh,
transcendent.
but during all of those years, even before I was born again as a child and through high school and into the 20s, I was a learner. It's not like Christians are not learning and not learning all sorts of good stuff. You know, it's not like Christians are stupid people whose brains are not engaged in all sorts of world things. And so I was, you know, I was reading science and I was reading some philosophy and music, of course. Music was a big part of my life. Playing chess and solving puzzles and entering content. I mean, there's more to life than just Sunday morning. And then, you know, so after leaving the faith and intellectually realizing, first intellectually, then later emotionally realizing that all of that stuff was just, you know, make believe, I realized, well, I didn't really lose anything. I didn't really lose that much. And I still have that lifelong, this drive forward to keep learning and growing and studying. Then I started doing debates, which was really fun. In 1985, I did my first public moderated debate as an atheist in Nashville. And I loved that. Thinking on my feet in front of a live audience of mostly hostile believers, that was really fun. And last November, I did my 140th public moderated debate at Oxford University. And I have a couple more coming up. And I just love that. So the whole thing of, yeah, I've turned this corner, and that was good when it lasted. Okay, that was fine. But I'm out of high school now, and let's move on here, and let's start living a more fulfilling life. And so peace, I don't know if peace really matters. Maybe just some of us are more peaceful people than others, but I'm certainly not tormented by fears of judgment or any of that.
Gotcha. I guess what I meant was, for me, I struggled, I think, with the sense always of, am I doing enough for God? Am I honoring Him? But there was still this overarching sense of like, God is my Father. He's my King. He's in control. He's sovereign. I was a 5-point Calvinist who was very sovereign. I'm okay. I'm wrapped up in the loving arms of God, and He'll make it okay. At the end of the day, even if the world falls apart around me, it's okay. And when I look at the emotional well-being and the mental health that I had as I was escaping, I honestly almost started laughing. Like when I deconverted, it was around October of 2019, and I was sitting in front of my computer, and I'd been studying stuff for 3 years. And it started with, we were 3 years earlier, we were sitting around doing Bible time with our kids, as you do, teaching them these songs and the verses, and we're singing Joshua fought the battle of Jericho. And I'm thinking, it's just a fun little song, but I'm thinking in my head, I know what happens next in the story. Genocide, land theft, slavery, child brides, and all that, and worse. And I'm thinking, do I want to teach my kids this stuff? And of course, that wasn't enough to deconvert me, which is like, oh, that's an angst. It's a splinter in my mind. I got to figure this out because I have to defend the Bible. The Bible's is the truth. And for 3 years, I began investigating stuff and researching stuff. And 3 years later, I'm sitting in front of my computer, and it just hit me out of the blue, like, I don't know if this is real. And I was like, is it real? And my immediate thought was like, there's no way it's not real. There's no way, number one, that many millions, billions of people have been deceived. And my immediate thought was like, well, the Buddhists we think are deceived, the Muslims, why couldn't we have been deceived? And I just kept on thinking through it. And it was all within the space of an hour. And it was like this voice inside of me was saying, say the words, Tim, say the words. And it finally, I like had the bravery, like, it's not real. It's not real. And as soon as I said it, I was like, that makes so much more sense of my entire existence so far, that this has never been real. That makes exponential more sense of what my experience has been like. And as soon as I know some people, they struggle with the angst and the loss of like, wow, I've lost so much. And I still struggle, like I said, with the loss of the afterlife. But I honestly started laughing a little bit. It's like, oh my gosh, I could have gone to my deathbed thinking this was real. I've at least got hopefully some time left to actually live my real life. This is awesome. I could have been stuck in this till my deathbed. I just won the lottery. I've got some time to be me and actually look at life for the first time. I was excited and delighted. And honestly, the peace in that first hour and for sure the first day and week far exceeded the collective 43 years of being a Christian before then. And it was an amazing journey to think that the peace of God that passes all understanding has nothing compared to the reality of escaping a mythology-based worldview that has been nothing but a prison for your mind. I was overjoyed. I literally felt like I won the lottery.
So you should transcribe what you just said. That would be a good book. Story.
I am actually working on a book. It's going to be a while, but I'm working on one. I'd love to share my story in more detail. Wow. So how did you reset your life at that point? Like when you were at that stage, what were some of the things that you said, now that I'm not going to be a preacher, I'm not going to be reading the Bible every day and all this, I'm not spending Sunday mornings in church. What were some of the things that you did to sort of reset yourself and even just create some rituals and just new habits?
Well, first I want to say that I can relate to your story. It's like you have this one part of your mind, it's devoted, but there's the other part of your mind over here. I remember a lot of times, especially driving the freeways of Southern California, thinking, I was praying to God, still praying. And another part of my mind was saying, what are you doing, Dan? It was almost like I became my own science experiment. You know what I mean? If you can get your brain intellectually to say, not just do what you're doing, but step over here and watch yourself do what you're doing. And I think that's what's happening with you, right? When you were having that experience of, and that points to something in our mind that wants to learn and grow and break and progress, and that's never stopped. That's never stopped. And to me, that's the goal of life: is learning what's true and learning what's not true, and learning where you're wrong, and writing it all down. And it's a joy. I think the joy of learning and the joy of actually living in the real world is much better than the fakey pretend world of mythology and superstition.
Hmm. I, I sometimes ask people this question. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. When you look back at what you used to believe, what are some of the things that you think are the craziest that should have arguably gotten you out a lot sooner? Like where you'd say, I can't believe I did this and thought that and preached this and believe it. What were some of the things that you just thought, I that's obviously mythology. That's obviously a crazy idea.
Well, for me, the big one was evolution, of course. Uh, I knew, just like you knew, that evolution was a lie of the devil. It was false. It was,
Oh yeah.
but um, and I write this in my next book. I have a chapter about this. Um, I realized after I started reading about it, instead of just imagining what it was, I didn't have a clue what it was. I didn't even know. I knew it was bad. I had this totally twerped idea what evolution was, and these evil scientists are trying. The scientists are embracing evolution because they don't want to embrace God. They need to find some excuse so that they can ignore the uh, the authority and the moral sovereignty of God over their lives because they don't want to submit their moral life. That's the motivation of these evil scientists coming up with this crazy idea of evolution. And I wish I had studied it earlier. I wish I had had a good grounding. I think in high school, my science requirements were met with physics. I don't think I even took biology in high school. I don't know why. And at the Christian college, I took a biology class, but it was mostly taxonomy. It wasn't like theory or any of that stuff. So now looking back on it, I feel really embarrassed at not only how not only that I was ignorant. I mean, that's one thing to be embarrassed about, but that I was having this totally wrong idea about it, and not only about what it was, but about the motivation, all of that stuff. It's embarrassing now, but I guess that's part of growing up, isn't it? You learn and you say, "Oops, I was wrong." And by the way, you also agree, I think, that there are many good Christians who accept the fact of evolution. You can be a theistic evolutionist, not necessarily a um, you know total creationist.
Yeah, exactly. And sort of before I did want to take us to in some different directions here as we head towards the end of our interview, but just to wrap up your specific part of your story, how did people respond to you when you started to be more public? Was there shunning? Was there hate? Was there acceptance? How did that journey, part of the journey go?
Yes, it was all of that. After I sent that letter out, I sent about 50 letters out to friends and family and Christian publishers and record producers and co-ministers, co-missionary, everyone I could think of. I sent this one-page letter. I didn't want a big argument. Um, and I got to tell you, when I dropped those in the mailbox, do you remember stamps on envelopes? That
Oh, yeah.
dropped them in the mailbox. I was hesitated for a second, and I was thinking, this is going to make a difference. When I let go of these, but I went ahead and put them in and said, okay, mail those. So I got some really ugly responses, surprisingly ugly, hateful responses from people who I thought were my friends. I thought, we're friends, we can talk about this. But no, some of them just like, and I guess that's a really good way to test a friendship, isn't it? I mean, if we really were good friends, we would have kept something, but no. And on the other hand, I also got some surprisingly warm and loving responses from Christians who are still friends today. You know what I mean? Because we realize we really like each other and respect each other as people, even though we disagree. So if you imagine the response, I got the response, and I got some ugly things, and I realize, and you maybe feel the same way, that those quote unquote friends that were lost, there was no loss there in the first place, because a true friendship should not be contingent I'll be your friend as long as you're in the same club with me. Is that a friendship? Or, it's a conditional thing. It's not really a real friendship where you just really like each other's people. So, yeah, I lost some friends, but boy, how many thousands of friends, other friends are there out in the world to, and I tell the story in the book about how when I met Annie Laurie Gaylor, we're married now, we met on the Oprah Winfrey Show in Chicago. It was called AM Chicago. And that was the first day that I had ever knowingly met another atheist and talked with. It was on that show. And it was also the first day that I'd ever publicly spoken about my atheism. Because once you're a minister and you leave, what do? Where do you talk? So I got invited to that show. And you can watch that show online. I'm putting these words together. It's for the first time I'm putting together these thoughts that in front of an audience. And today they just flow out. But back then it was like the first time I was trying to say it. And it was also the first time that I had publicly spoken before a hostile audience, which was really different. And I loved that. I thought, this is cool. This is like, I'm actually getting a sincere, honest reaction from the audience. Like when you're a pastor in front of an audience, how sincere is that? I mean, really, you know what I mean? It's a self-selected thing. And I thought that was great. And I still love doing that. So there's plenty of friends in the world, and you don't have to limit yourself to the loyalty to those who are in the same tribe as you. There's a bigger world out there.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. With the whole process of deconversion that so many people are going through, there's a lot of talk about religious trauma and just the pain, some of it related to Christians actively attacking you or shunning you. But there's also just a religious trauma of looking back at where you've been, this message that there's a God that sort of loves you unconditionally, but with so many conditions. And, if you do fall away, the price to pay is very, very dire, and it's eternal. The idea that you're bad, everything from you're just born bad, you're born condemned, to your sexuality is going to probably become a part of this story where you're in some way thinking dirty thoughts and God's upset at you. All this stuff, and you don't feel safe in your own skin for maybe decades of your life, and then you deconvert, and you're just starting to get through all these weeds of like, wow, like my life is totally different now. What do you say to people who you can tell as they talk through their story, they're not just intellectually shifting worldviews. They're not just aware, yeah, I studied the mythology, I went to, took comparative mythology classes, I learned enough to know that the Bible is based on some other earlier stories and all that kind of stuff. But they're looking back at what they've been telling themselves and what their parents told them, the pastors told them, and their self-talk for years has been, you're a bad person, and God sees inside your head and hates you in some ways. And they're starting to heal for the first time ever. And it's like they're realizing, like you said, the onion concept, the layers are there of all this trauma. What do you say to people who are just getting started and they're just like, this is so dark? How do you help those people?
Well, it gets better, is what I would say. It's tough at first, and we're all different. And maybe for women it's worse because they were more subjugated, and some of them might have been abused in many ways, and many of them were actually. But for men as well, it's anytime there's a big change in your life, when somebody has a death in the family and they're initially grieving, it's probably not a good idea to tell them it gets better, because that grief actually is a form of love. They're missing someone that they loved. But if they can step back and think, this is horrible right now, I don't know how I'm going to deal with this, but others have done it. Thousands of others have done it, and they tell me it gets better. So you can at least go with that. You can know that others have gone through it. And since we're all different, the timing's going to be different. For me, it was about 1 year, roughly. And I think that's probably true with grief and with divorce. I mean, a year is kind of like maybe, I don't know, a ballpark. Maybe for others it's 5 or 10 years, but and maybe others, they just snap and forget it all. I don't know. So it does get better. And the only way to break a habit is with another habit. So establish other habits now. start getting in the habit of thinking this way and reading these things and asking these questions and hanging out with these groups of people and learning these things, whatever you like in life. We all have different likes. Um, something that gets you out of bed in the morning because something that you just can't not do, like playing the piano for me, or writing. I love getting up really early and coming to write. It's not a chore. It's not a job. It's not like, oh, I gotta go write. It's like, wait, yes. So find something in life like that you just, because life's going to end, you may as well enjoy the ride as we're here. So um, I know Dan Savage, that was his line. It gets better. He's talking about gays who've come out and they're really struggling coming out to their family, and some of them are kicked out of the house. And he tells them, it happened to me and it's happened to others, and it does get better.
Well said. Well said. Just had a couple final questions about your perspective. Then I wanted to get to two main topics at the end: the Contradiction book, and then talk a little bit about the Freedom from Religion Foundation. I wanted to throw a bit of a curveball question here to wrap up the part of the interview. It's strictly about you. Why do you think there's something rather than nothing? I'm sure you've heard them use that as an argument for Christianity or just theism in general. I know we don't know, and anything we offer is just a best guess. But if you had to give some answer to that, why do you think that there's something rather than nothing? And like, what's your perspective on metaphysics at this point in terms of what do you think we're living in?
So I have a chapter on one of my books called Much Ado About, which doesn't finish Shakespeare, but and basically, I think that question being asked is an incoherent question in the first place, because the word nothing really isn't a definable word. If you think about it in English, the word nothing means no thing. So you can't have nothing unless you first have a thing that you have nothing of. What's a pothole in the road is an absence of road, right? If you were to remove the road, there would be no pothole. So it's, in order to think about nothing, you have to have something to start with. So it's an incoherent thing. How can something come from nothing? So you would move it up a logical level and say, well, we're talking about nothingness. What about nothingness? What is that? Well, that's an incoherent thing as well. And there's a number of cute answers to it. I don't think the question has to even be answered because it's not even a coherent question. But we could say, there's two ways to look at the singularity. We could say, imagine a state of utter nothingness. How can you even imagine a state of utter nothingness? What is that even? You're still imagining something, aren't you? Some stateness in which nothingness would be one of those possibilities, right? There would be a context, and there's somethingness and there's nothingness, and why are we choosing the two? Well, then both of those exist within something even broader conceptual or metaphysical space. But if there were a state of utter nothingness, if we can imagine that, pretend like we can, not only would it lack space or time or matter or energy or any things, it would also lack laws. There would be no law in a state of utter nothingness. It would lack a law that says nothing comes from nothing. Think about that. There would be nothing prohibiting something coming from nothing, because there would be no reason to prohibit at all. We could flip it around and say a state of, at least we know that something exists, somethingness exists. And in Christian theology, of course, there is no such concept of utter nothingness, because God is something. If there's a God, then he exists. So God couldn't even create something out of nothing. God, when you create something, you're creating. And in a number of my debates, we can talk about this maybe in the Contradiction book. You hear about fine-tuning. The universe was fine-tuned so that life could exist. Do they imagine that this deity was, I don't know, walking around, floating around, and stumbled upon this primal sea of constants and variables and forces and said, oh, I'm going to turn this dial and fix this. I'm going to make something come from nothing. On the other hand, flip it around and think, if the singularity, whatever that was, instead of being this zero-dimensional point of ultimate infinite density, whatever that means, and some people posit that, if 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 it were everything instead of nothing, because that singularity would, at that point in time, there wouldn't even have been time or a point or even space. At that singularity, it wouldn't have been nothing. It would have been everything. It would have been everything that there was, right? And so, under those conditions of that immense singularity, at that point, physicists know that all the laws of nature break down at that point. They all just told that they don't make any sense at that point. And if all the laws of nature break down, well, then you're back to the beginning. There is no law saying that nothing comes from nothing. Either way, it's total chaos. Either way, there's no rules governing it. Either way, we can't talk about it coherently in any sense. And so, what we can do, at least, is observe that there is something. We can at least do that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Somebody told me many years ago. It was an atheist at the time. I didn't ask him too much about why he believed this, but he said, I don't think that this universe is special. I don't think a God made it. And he said, best way I say it is, I think this whole thing is a drop in somebody's watering can. We're all living in somebody's watering can. It's interesting to think about. We've got so little that we know compared to what we need to make an informed decision.
Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned the contradiction book. I'd love to hear just what does that word mean, and what can people expect as they hopefully pick that up in September.
So it's a new word. It's a brand new word, and I was kind of worried that it wasn't, but it's pretty confirmed now. It's not contradiction; it's contraduction, and it comes from a lot of debates I've been doing about the design argument, and the most powerful design argument. Not that it's great, but it's the theist's best shot. It's the fine-tuning argument for the existence of God. I was talking about those variables and those constants and we all know that if any one of the forces or parameters or ratios of the constants in our universe, if any one of them were off by even the slightest amount, life would not be permissible. It looks like the whole universe was exquisitely fine-tuned so that we could exist. It looks like it. And even non-theistic philosophers and scientists, Steven Weinberg, he said, how do you explain this? And so during one of my debates, my opponent, Adam Johnson, said the best explanation for this is an abductive argument to an intelligent designer. What's the best explanation for this fine-tuning but a fine-tuner, right? And he's right. It's an option you can put on the table. You can say, well, if it's fine-tuned, there must be a tuner. And he said that word abductive. And I thought, I know what that means. Abductive. Yeah. Abductive reasoning is very weak. We have deductive reasoning where we produce conclusions in propositional logic, conclusions from premises. We have inductive reasoning, which produces premises from observations. What is abductive? And abductive really is just kind of a best guess or an inference to the best explanation kind of thing. It doesn't really conclude. It just says, hey, we've got a possibility here. It's kind of like investigators of a crime. We're going to come up with a prime suspect. That's the best they can do. They can't even file any charges or produce a verdict or send them to jail. At least they're looking. So the abductive reasoning for fine-tuning is probably the strongest design argument that theists have, because it's pretty impressive when you think about it. So I realized when I stood up to give my opening statement that abductive doesn't work if you're pointed the wrong direction. If you're pointed backwards, then your suggestion is not really on the table anymore. And it's kind of like this is silly, but it's kind of like the guy who's amazed, how did they make all those rivers flow right along the state border? How did they do that? It must have been a huge, expensive, massive civic project to get all those rivers to perfectly fine-tuned to the state border, right? Well, that's silly, right? Because the rivers came first. So it's backward thinking. A lot of these design arguments are backward thinking. They're pointing the wrong way. Or it's like being totally amazed. Look at how perfectly intelligently designed the human nose is to support a pair of eyeglasses. Look at that. How do you explain that? I mean, that requires some explanation. Well, of course, that's silly. It's reversed. It's backward. And so I thought, you know what? Instead of deduction, induction, abduction, uh, we need a word called contraduction, reversing things from one way to the other. And a good example is, have you ever been sitting on a train that's not moving next to another train that's not moving? And this other train starts to move, and you briefly think it's you who's moving. Has that ever happened to you? Like
Yep.
in a car, you got it backwards. Your point of view, from your point of view, you're looking at the world, and things are happening. It looks like it's happening to you, but it's the other way around. And so the sunrise is one example. We call it the sunrise from our point of view, but the sun's not rising. And Ptolemy in the second century, Ptolemy had to come up with this complicated spheres within spheres and retrograde motions to come up with explaining all the movements of the planets, and it was this totally, you know, Rube Goldberg machine complicated explanation for how do we explain all this, when really it's flipped. It's what I use the word contraductive. It's backwards, and once you flip it around, the question just disappears. You realize that the sun's not rising. I don't have to explain that anymore. We got it totally backwards. So in my book, I coined the word contraduction, and I give a whole bunch of examples. One of them is sleep. We assume, we ask, what's the purpose of sleep? I think that's contradictory. We should be assuming sleep's the default state of any living organism. What's the purpose of being awake? Another one is the universe and the Big Bang. Which way should we look at it, this way or that way? If you can flip things around. Another one is, of course, evolution. Is life bottom up or top down? And mirrors. I have a whole chapter on mirrors. What do mirrors actually do? You know. Then I have one on morality. Is morality top down, ordered, commanded to us, or is morality a bottom up human thing? So it's contradicting the way we think it was. We're flipping it around 180 degrees. And then I have a chapter on free will, which I kind of hope doesn't necessarily answer the question of free will, but it just makes the question incoherent. It's like, why are we even asking this question? Because we're thinking about it like this, when we should be looking in the mirror and flipping the mirror this way. And so it took a couple years to write that. And on the front cover of the book, Steven Pinker wrote a glowing blurb for it. And by the way, Steven Pinker is the editor of the American Heritage Dictionary, which, if it's still functioning, there's a chance maybe in 10 or 20 years this new word will get in the dictionary. Who knows? He wrote a blurb that's just at the top. And then the British philosopher A.C. Grayling wrote a nice endorsement at the bottom. This is a must read. And then I got about 20 others, including from Ron Reagan, the son of President Ronald Reagan, and from Andrianne, who was the wife of Carl Sagan, and who wrote most of those books and all these cosmos theories, and Robert Sapolsky and Michael Shermer, and just a lot of others. And I think it's one of these things that if you can put a word to it, the original subtitle was Contradiction, the hidden fallacy that inverts reality. It's not a form of reasoning, it's a fallacy. It happens to all of us in our daily lives. Because of our point of view, we're looking through the back end of the telescope, thinking we're going to understand. And then the second subtitle, they scrapped that one, was going to be Contradiction, the death of the design argument, which I like that. And eventually the publisher said, we don't need a subtitle. Let's just call it Contradiction. And then we can use contradiction for many things. And I invite the reader to look for it in their own life, in their own fields. You'll probably come, and I'm starting a webpage, contradiction.com, where you might think of examples that you spot, because now that you have a word and you can think about it, I get it. I see what's happening. So I'm really excited about this. This is it's like being pregnant and there's a baby's going to be born in a few months. So
that's so cool. I remember as a kid, I had a neighbor who had a map. It was called Corrective Map of the World, but it was just the map flipped upside down. So it reminds me a little bit of that.
Yeah, I mentioned that too. Why shouldn't Europe be called Down Under?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, I look forward to reading that so much. I'll definitely pick up a copy. And in terms of the last big question that was on my mind, and I certainly invite you to share anything else too after that that's on your heart. But the Freedom from Religion Foundation, FFRF, Could you tell us a little bit more about what you all do and just what people can expect? Because you all have a YouTube channel, you've got the website, but you all are doing a lot of amazing things. For anyone that doesn't know what FFRF is about and what they're doing, could you tell us more about them?
We're the largest free thought organization in the country. We have more than 40,000 members. And free thought is a kind of an umbrella word that includes atheists, agnostics, secular humanists, non-believers, skeptics. We're not strictly an atheist group, although I think most of our members would be atheists or agnostics. We even have a few religious people. We work primarily to keep state and church separate. And we do that through legal action. We have a team of attorneys. I think it's 9 full-time attorneys now, writing legal letters and filing lawsuits, challenging violations of the First Amendment. And people join us because they like the fact that we're doing something. We're actually going to bat. We're actually making a difference. It's great to have an organization that talks and discusses. That's wonderful, and we do that too. We have that at our conventions and on our radio show, our TV show. But Ann Gaylor, the principal founder of Freedom from Religion Foundation, said things like, after all is said and done, usually more is said than done. So we want to do something. And so we're known for that. And if you become a member, you know that you're helping us to actually make difference and challenging and winning. Most of the lawsuits we take, we actually win. And the ones that we don't win, most of the time, those are lost, not on the merits, but lost on standing. We won a lawsuit challenging the National Day of Prayer, and that decision on the merits was not overturned, but the court overturned it on standing, saying you can't sue. We won over the faith-based initiative, and so on. The second thing we do is we educate the public about the views of the non-theist, whatever word we use. And so we publish books, and we have a radio show, and we have a national newspaper, and we have, of course, a huge, huge webpage. We have a Free Thought of the Day showing in history what free thinker was born and what were their views. And you can even sign up if you want to get a daily Free Thought of the Day. On this day in history, this person was born and they didn't believe, or whatever. It's pretty fun. It started in 1976. Ann Gaylor and her daughter, Annie Laurie Gaylor, who was a college student, and Annie Laurie and I are married now. They started it as a local group, and in 1978, it went national, and through a lot of media and through a lot of successful lawsuits, has grown. We expanded our building. We're in Madison, Wisconsin, right near the state capitol. We expanded our building. There's about 30 or 34 full-time staff, including a whole legal floor, really smart attorneys working on different issues on state church separation. And we have a TV show called Free Thought Matters, which broadcasts in a number of cities around the country. We just interviewed Donald C. Johanson, the paleoanthropologist who discovered the Lucy fossil. That was a fun interview. So you can find out all about that. You can watch it live, or you can see it on the YouTube channel. And then our radio show has been going since 2006. We're coming up to like 930th show, I guess. We interview guests on various topics. So that's the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
On that note, I was curious regarding politics. Do you think that this country is in any way open to an atheist president in the next few generations?
Yeah. I mean, it will happen. It can happen. Now in Congress now there's this new caucus called the Congressional Free Thought Caucus, which is about 5 years old now. They just got their 23rd member, and they're not all atheists or agnostics. Some of them are believers who support state church separation and who support free inquiry. And just this last week, Annie Laurie and I and a number of other groups were in D.C. at one of the congressional buildings with Representative Huffman and Representative Jeremy Raskin and others, talking about how to protect our secular democracy. So, and of course, Jared Huffman of California, he's very open. He said, I'm the one open non-believer in Congress. And he said, but I got to tell you, there's a bunch of them in the closet still. So I'm not the only one, which is kind of cool to hear. And he knows who they are, but he said for political reasons, some of them just have to be careful, depending on their district. By the way, when Jared Huffman came out as a non-believer, as a member of Congress, people were wondering how that would affect his next election. He did better in the next election. So it can happen, and you know, I lost the gift of prophecy years ago, so I can't tell you what's going to happen. But wait, let me see if I can tap back into this. Nope, it's gone. Um, but this younger generation is less uptight. The younger generation now are much less religious than before, and as they're coming of age and are voting more, a person's religious beliefs aren't going to matter that much to them. It's only the evangelicals and the Christian nationalists who think that's important, who think that they still run this country. But so, yeah, it could happen. I mean, why not? There are other countries that have had open atheist leaders, so the United States might be kind of slow to catch up, but I think it can happen.
Do you think the Christian nationalist threat is increasing or decreasing in terms of how serious we should take that threat? Because I've kind of got my finger on the pulse of some of it, and some of it seems kind of scary. But I also don't know in the big picture. Sometimes it's these people have a loud bark, but their bite isn't very strong. But some of them seem very well organized and very well funded, and very stealthy. And how serious do you think we should take that threat?
It is a threat. It's a serious threat, and we're already living through it. I mean, Trump is one example of that. And they are well funded. They have a lot of money. They have structures that go back many, many decades. They're here. They're part of our country. I mean, they're, of course, free to vote and express their views. They're a minority, and they are a shrinking minority, which doesn't mean they're becoming less dangerous. Catherine Stewart, in her book, The Power Worshipper, shows how a small minority of really dedicated people can turn everything. And that kind of happened with the 81% of evangelicals who voted for Trump in 2016. They nudged that election just enough. 81% of evagelicals. Uh, Luckily, my brother Tom is an evangelical. He's part of the 19% who did not vote for Trump. I mean, there's a lot of good Christians out there who can see the phoniness and who would never vote for somebody like that. I mean, the Christian nationalists have abandoned theology. They're purely political. What they want is political control. The whole Christian national thing is not about the love of Jesus. It's about their supremacy. They're regaining their right to be the leaders of this country. So demographically, it looks like they're losing. Their numbers are getting smaller. There's fewer people believing in this country than there were before, especially among young people. But I think it's kind of like a wounded animal. You've shot this animal, it's wounded in the forest and it's dying, and it knows it's dying, but it wants to take everything down it can with it while it's dying. And I think that's where they are right now. They know they're dying. They're losing all these battles. Of course, they got a victory with the overturning Roe v. Wade, but gay marriage and prayer in schools and evolution is all they've been losing, and they know it, and they hate it, and they're angry. Well, you and I used to feel that way, right? The liberal advances. We used to feel like we thought we were the ones being attacked when it was the other way around. There's a contradiction, huh? Look, when you think your victim is your perpetrator, that's a contradiction. So in the short term, they're going to do, and they are doing, an awful lot of damage, which is why we have to fight.
I definitely can relate to what you said about how we used to be on that side of it. My dad used to work for Jerry Falwell, and so we even though we moved, when I was growing up, we weren't near Jerry Falwell anymore. We grew up watching Jerry Falwell all the time, and of course, the moral majority and that kind of stuff was just rammed down our throats, and listening to Jim Dobson, of course, all the time, Focus on the Family. So yeah, it was interesting how like that's your passion, and we're the ones being persecuted, and or that we have got this martyr complex, and then you shift it and you're like, holy smokes, it's all
Yeah,
upside down, all upside down.
yeah. Isn't that amazing? But it happens. And you know the Bible verse, blessed are you when men shall revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be glad. And so I remember feeling we are a misunderstood, persecuted Christian minority in this big bad world that's ganging up against us. And that mentality is hard to shake. Feel like it's weaponizing something. It's oh, what's the phrase for it? It's like if you're being persecuted if you are being prohibited from persecuting others, you know,
Yeah.
my Christian values don't allow me to love gays. And since you're telling me that you're persecuting me. And that's totally flipping. It's a totally selfish, self-centered kind of thing, but it's human nature, I guess.
It's amazing when you realize that so much of this really is back to tribalism. And unfortunately, I think a lot of it's too is white supremacy, but it's at bare bones, it's tribalism. We want the us versus them mentality, and hopefully we can start to shift that too. Because I love how atheists are not against Christians. Like we're against their ideas, and especially about the ways that they psychologically damage people, especially children. But like we're not against them. We want Christians to thrive, but of course, a lot of them would not return that favor. They would not want us to thrive and be okay. They'd want us to very much be marginalized and to have our voices taken away. And it's so crazy how beautiful it is when you finally deconvert and you realize all these people of various faiths, Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, everybody, they're all and all gender orientations, they're all my friends, they're all my
Mhm.
family in a sense. We're all from the same family tree. We're all connected to each other into this planet. And it gives you the eyes to see each other through the eyes of love for the first time. It's a beautiful transition.
Mhm. Well, let me illustrate that with my mother. When I left the faith, my mom and dad were really shocked. But after a year or two, my mom started thinking. She stopped going to church. She said, "You know what? Danny is right. I never thought about it. It's rare that your parents deconvert after you do." And my mom said, "You know what? He's talking about knowledge and love, and he's right, and it's phony." And she became an atheist like a year later. And then my dad was like a year after that. He said, "Yeah, you know what? Yeah, finally." And my mom said, and I had this quote in the book. My mom said, "You know what? It's so nice being an atheist because I don't have to hate anymore." Isn't that
Mm.
something?
What a great way to put it. That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I've so appreciated getting to hear more of your story today. This has been awesome. Before we wrap up, I do want to ask: was there anything else on your heart in terms of anything we didn't get to, or any projects, or just anything you wanted to say before we wrap up? And you can kind of give us the final word there, and then I'll take us to the end.
Okay, music. As a gospel musician, and I hear a lot of people say they don't miss the faith, they don't miss the theology, but they miss the music. It's something to do with being in a choir, or. So I've been I've been doing now free thought music for almost what 35 years, and I included a few gospel songs. Well, um, this summer, I don't know when your show is going to air, but in June, end of June here, 2024, we are going to perform in Manhattan, right off Broadway on 42nd Street, a show called Godless Gospel. And this is gospel music, as in black gospel music, the real stuff. We have found Andre Forbes, who's a former gospel songwriter, producer, performer, musician. He has now left the faith and he's left the phoniness of it all. And he's found some other musicians who are the same way. And we found some singers who also have former gospel singers who have left. And we have totally rewritten, we didn't rewrite, we've totally written brand new songs, quote unquote gospel songs, but with godless lyrics. So I Don't Need Jesus is one of the songs, and The Natural World. And it's that same jump out of your seat kind of music that makes you want to clap your hands and feel the spirit. But it's all the real world. So it's called Godless Gospel. And it's really exciting. I wrote some songs back in the 80s and 90s, but I could never do them right. I could never, like, really have the punch. So Andre and Mandisa Thomas, who's with Black Nonbelievers, um, to hear a bunch of these wonderful singers, we're going to put on this show. We've done the show twice before, and for me, that's going to be one of the highlights. We're going to be right on 42nd Street in Manhattan, and it's a thing for our members. We're not going to sell tickets, but our members can come to the thing, and that's going to be like, just, if I can borrow a word, that's going to be heaven on earth performing godless gospel in Manhattan.
That is awesome. I'm going to try to see if I can get there. I'm not sure if I can, but if I can, I will make it. That's awesome.
Mm.
Is that going to be recorded? Will we be able to see it on YouTube later, potentially?
Well, we're probably not going to record the Manhattan show. We do have two recordings of earlier shows,
Okay.
and you can just Google right now godless gospel YouTube, and you'll see there's two different shows that we did, and you'll see the songs. And if you like that kind of music, and who doesn't really, and you'll see the audience are atheists and agnostics, and they're on their feet almost like they're in the spirit. It's because music is universal. Music is not a spiritual thing. Music motivates all of us. So you can have all of the benefits of all what you thought was this quote unquote spiritual life without any faith at all.
Yeah, exactly. It's amazing too. I've said this before, but it's amazing how much creativity is coming out of the atheist, agnostic, deconverting community, because you realize that you have so much to process, and that life gets so much more beautiful, and yet there's also so much pain. And out of all this pain and beauty and the contradictions of your past life versus your current life, it's like you have such a story to tell. And when you get people who are creative, whether it's poetry or singing or even art like painting, people coming up with such great ways to show the creativity that's in their heart from this journey. And it's like, that verse, out of the overflow of the heart the mouth speaketh. And it's like, it's the same concept. Our hearts are overflowing with joy that we've escaped this worldview, and we've got a
Yeah,
story to tell, and it comes out in art. It's amazing to see
yeah,
it. I see it stronger and stronger every week. It's so cool.
yeah.
Hmm. Well, I just want to say thank you so much, Dan. Again, this is an honor beyond honors to me to be speaking with you. You are a hero beyond heroes to so many of us. We've appreciated you so much. And I just want to recommend again to everyone who's been watching, please go check out their YouTube channel, their website, all these other links. Of course, the book, you can, I'm sure, do a pre-order soon for the book and a Contradiction. But please go like and subscribe and everything for Dan so that he is able to continue, helping and impacting the community. But Dan, it's been so wonderful to speak with you. Thank you so much for your time today.
And someday we'll talk about your future book, maybe.
Absolutely. It's coming. All right. Well, we've been speaking with Dan Barker. Dan, thanks again. Have a wonderful day. Appreciate it.